So first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm today joining from Aboriginal land. This was stolen land that was never ceded. I'm joining from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people here in Naarm. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people who are here today. So we are here today to talk to Jeff Goodell, who's here with me, about his latest book, The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet, which I've been reading and obviously making a lot of notes about, we can see. This session is being hosted by Sweltering Cities. I'm the executive director and founder of Sweltering Cities, and some of my colleagues are also here today. Sweltering Cities works directly with communities impacted by extreme heat. We've started in 2020 and we're now a national organisation with work on the ground in Sydney and Melbourne. Our three key areas of work is community organising, strategic campaigns, and telling a different story about extreme heat. And what that means is saying, you know, at the moment, on extremely hot days, on record heat days, there's a tendency of the media to sometimes cover that as positive news, have pictures of people at the beach. And what we want to do is put the stories of people with the lived experience of extreme heat, who can speak to the challenges, speak to the risk, front and center when we talk about heat waves. And that's why we're here talking to Jeff today, because his new book, it does exactly that. It challenges the way that we all think about heat. It puts the stories of people who are highly impacted right at the center, and it really gives an incredible impression of that visceral the visceral sense of extreme heat. So we're really excited to have him here today with us. So Jeff is, as I said, the author of The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet, but he's also the author of 6 previous books, including The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and The Remaking of a Civilized World, which I've read and I can strongly recommend, which was a New York Times Critics' Top Book of 2017. Jeff's also been covering climate change for more than 2 decades at Rolling Stone, and has discussed climate and energy issues on NPR, MSNBC, CNN, ABC, NBC, Fox News, and the Oprah Winfrey Show, which is amazing. He's a senior fellow at the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, which is how I first met Jeff, through the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance. And he's a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow. So Jeff, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And thanks for joining us in such a different time zone. I think you're in Texas, so a very different time of day, and probably, as we were just talking about, incredibly different weather right now. It's quite cool in Melbourne, and you're saying it's still 38 degrees in the evening in Austin.
Yeah, 38 degrees, sun is just going down. It was about 40 earlier today, which is actually relatively cool given the temperatures we've had in the last few weeks. So it's been really hot here.
Yeah, it's been quite shocking seeing, as always, even as someone who works in this area, what the heat has been like in North America. And I think I've been reading that 12 or 15 people might have died in national parks over the last weeks, going on hikes and not being well prepared. So let's kick off into the book. So to begin with, your goal for the book, you say, is to get us to think about heat in a different way. Can you tell us a bit more about why we need to think differently about heat?
Yeah, we need to think differently about heat because heat is a dangerous force that will kill us. And as we move into a hotter world, being smarter about heat is going to become more and more urgent and more important. I have been writing about climate change for 20 years, and obviously the idea of heat is no secret in the climate, any kind of climate conversation, right? It's called global warming, right? But I never really thought about heat as a phenomenon itself. Until I happened to be walking down the street in Phoenix. I happened to be there on a day that was 42, 43 C. And I just walked 10 or 12 blocks and I felt myself kind of getting dizzy and my heart pounding. And I thought, oh my God, this is scary. I just walked 12 blocks and I'm already feeling it. And it made me think about oh, this is, a more dangerous thing than I had understood. And, what are the implications of this? And it just really struck me how lethal that heat felt to me. And then I started kind of noodling around with it and talking to friends, and I realized, I realized that I didn't even know what heat was. I I couldn't have described heat to you. I could have told you about temperature, and I could say that 95 degrees is warmer than 92 degrees. But if you asked me to describe what heat was, I couldn't do it. So I thought, oh, this is an interesting subject to explore. And that's basically how the book was born.
Amazing. And I think I've, in some ways, gone through a similar process before we started Sweltering Cities, where you think about disasters as being really present, like in Australia, bushfires, floods, fires, like storms, so present, but heat is this underlying thing we experience. But now understanding that this is a disaster, this is heat that we've never experienced before. And that transition, I can really relate to that. You've also written a book about, this really incredible book about rising sea levels. What made you want to take on, well, you're saying, that experience of taking on heat waves after that book. But in terms of writing another book about environmental disasters, did you have to change your approach between writing about sea level rise and writing about heat in the way that you engage with experts or members of the public, or, looked at the community, looked at the world?
Yes and no. I mean, in both books, I tried to do a very novelistic, almost, character-based narrative storytelling. I obviously spent a lot of time with scientists and very familiar with and read a lot of science papers and things, but I sort of think of myself as a translator from, the world of science to the world of like ordinary people. And my job is to try to communicate this complex science in ways that is dramatic and revealing without being reductionist to that science. But there's a fundamental difference between, writing a book about sea level rise and writing a book about heat. And in fact, there's two. One is that nobody dies from sea level rise. I mean, there is obviously it increases storm surges, it can increase flooding, but you're not going to stand on the beach, in Sydney and drown because Antarctica is melting right at that moment, right? I mean, it's not a real-time mortality risk. There's lots of risk to real estate, there's lots of risk to investment, there's lots of risks to how we think about our cities, about the borders between land and sea, all of those things, and increased storm surges from hurricanes. But heat is sort of the opposite. Heat is very much about mortality. It's about this sort of killing force that not only will kill you, but is, every living thing on our planet, from oak trees to butterflies to polar bears, are vulnerable to changes in heat. And so that's one thing that's very different. The other thing that's very different is rising seas are kind of easy to see. I started my book about sea level rise when I went to Miami on what's called sunny day flooding, when it was sort of basically just a really high tide. And there was 2 feet of water in, this area called Sunset Harbor, which is one of the sort of wealthy neighborhoods of Miami. And I couldn't believe it. I was there on a perfectly sunny day, and there's 2 feet of water here. And I thought, oh my God, I could see the problem very visually. It was very clear. With heat, it's invisible. And so it's very hard to communicate. And so the challenge of writing about it is, how do you communicate and talk about the threat, the risks, the implications of this sort of invisible force? So part of my job in this book, I felt like, was to make visible the invisible. And that was not the case with the Sea Level Rise book.
Yes, I think that really resonates with the story in Australia, where even a couple of years ago, some NGOs and insurance bodies put out a map of the most at-risk areas from climate change in Australia. And of course, it was calculated using property damage. And so you saw the Gold Coast, for example, really low-lying area, bushfire-prone areas, we're seen as high risk of climate change, but Western Sydney was seen as at a low risk of climate change, even though, we've already seen temperatures up to 50 degrees on the ground in areas like Penrith. So, the choice of what to analyze and quantify, changes the way we think about climate impacts, and like heat has been excluded many ways. And I think the chapter in the book that follows a photojournalist to Pakistan to try and capture that image of like, what does heat look like? What is, because it can be a really private suffering. I was speaking to a doctor recently about what it's like in an emergency room during a heat wave, and he said, actually, the emergency room is busy, but that's not the problem. The problem is that people die alone in their homes and they're not found for days. And, we can't take pictures, like it's very hard to take a picture of that type of suffering and at scale. But you had a line in the book that it struck home with me. I've actually talked to people about it since I read it. Your line, the way we communicate about extreme heat is often distorted by nostalgia for a climate that no longer exists. And, that feels like it's very present in our media, very present in, the way we think about summers, even in Australia, like it, or probably all over the world. So I think this is linked to what you were just saying, but wondering, like, how did you approach trying to convey that visceral sense, that severity, and the physical and emotional toll of heat waves? Like, you've taken quite a global view of the issue. Was that part of that, like having the local and the global sense?
Yeah, I mean, part of the thing I'm trying to accomplish in this book is talking about heat on the sort of personal and micro level, what it does to you, to a human body as we, as you move into heat exhaustion, heat stroke, what actual happens to you when you're exposed to extreme heat, and understand, so that people can better, and so that I also could better understand what these risks are and how they work and what can be done about them. But also exploring heat as, this macro force, it is the primary driver behind all the other climate impacts, right? I mean, it is rising heat that is causing the glaciers to melt, that is causing the seas to rise. It is rising heat that is drying out the moisture in the soils, that is drying out then the trees, that is making wildfires bigger and hotter. It is the rising heat that is shifting the disease patterns as animals migrate in new ways. And, we get mosquitoes carrying dengue and Zika and malaria and things like that, moving to new regions. So I was trying to communicate the heat as the sort of major force, and heat as a micro force, as a thing that you have to worry about killing you if you're, and one of the ways I do this is by telling stories of some people who have who, in one case, the opening chapter of the book is about a family who went for a hike in California, a young family of 40. The man was 42, early 40s. The woman was in her late 30s. They had a 1-year-old baby and a dog, and they were pretty experienced with hiking and stuff. And they went out for a hike, and it was a hot day, not that hot, but it was about 40°C, 41°C, and they hiked out into a canyon. And in the middle of the day, they had to make this 1 mile, 1.5 mile hike out of this canyon on a switchbacks on a slope that had no shade, because there had been wildfires a few years earlier. And the next day, search parties who went out to see what happened to them, because they didn't show up back at their car or at home, found them all dead on the trail. And they died because of heat stroke. And there's many stories like that. Outdoor workers, suffer these kinds of fates, unfortunately, too often. People alone in their apartments, people alone in their houses, as you mentioned before. And one of the hard things about talking about the mortality of heat is that it's so poorly diagnosed, right? Heat is not like a gun that leaves a wound and it says, oh, there's a gunshot. There's not like a heat mark. So a lot of people who actually are succumbing to, heat exhaustion and heat stroke are diagnosed as heart attacks, right? Because that's often what kills you, because your heart starts pumping if you have any kind of weakness in your heart or circulatory system, you're much more vulnerable, which is why older people and people in poorer health are more vulnerable to extreme heat. So the real mortality, the real risks, I think, are vastly underappreciated, or undercounted. I mean, so I was trying to communicate, those two big things, and just to your last point, or your first point and my last point, is about this nostalgia idea. And I think one of the most important ideas that I'm trying to communicate in this book, also on the climate level, and others who are writing about this now are trying to communicate a similar thing, is that the climate we all grew up in is gone. It is different now. We are not only living in a hotter world, we're living in a world that has different rules. And that's when we don't quite know what those rules are. So the jet stream is moving in different ways, meandering around. The Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. We're seeing these kinds of extreme events that, the models that have predicted warming have been average global warming year over year with CO2 levels where they are, have been remarkably accurate. But the smaller scale extreme event modeling is not very accurate at all. So we had, in the US, we had a heat wave in 2021 in the Pacific Northwest and Washington State and in British Columbia, Canada. It was 121 degrees, which is, what is that, 43, 44 C, something like that, which is far, far beyond. It was like snow in the Sahara there. I mean, it's like no one predicted that. So we're in this realm of like wild unpredictability on the micro scale or the regional scale with these extreme events. And when that comes to heat in places that are unprepared for it, if you're uneducated about it and you don't know what to do or how dangerous it is, and we have media showing pictures of people at the beach or kids playing in sprinklers, it becomes a very dangerous combination.
Definitely. I think just to go on what you were talking there about, especially the vulnerable communities. And, we do know that, it's people who are older, people who have existing illnesses, people with disabilities, young kids, pregnant people, are really vulnerable. But something we saw in COVID in Australia was, and what we've seen now, I get weekly updates about the number of signed up to a government email list, about the number of people dying from COVID that we have sort of come to feel pretty neutral about, which, for a couple of years, it was something everyone followed on a day-to-day basis and shaped their, lives around. And now we've normalized the number of people dying. And I think part of that is people thinking, oh, these are vulnerable people, these people might get sick anyway. And you talk in the book about there is a calculus, like this sort of horrific but calm calculus of like a number of people will die, like a number of workers will die. And these are things we already know about what will happen, in the future. And in Australia, sometimes we've been talking, there's reports saying like Darwin is going to become potentially unlivable in a few decades' time. But what the word unlivable hides is that, a huge number of people will die before we understand that it's too dangerous to live there. But something you talk about in the book is the racism element of that as well. That's really firmly, I think also true in Australia, but is very true and very present in the US. I'm wondering if you could talk about how racism figures into, what we think of how different people can accept heat and live through heat and things like that, and how we therefore don't protect those people.
Yeah, well, I see that very clearly here in Texas, where I live, where most of the outdoor workers, whether it's building streets or building buildings or putting new roofs on houses or whatever it is, are Mexican. They could come across the border. The vast majority of the outdoor labor force here are Mexicans, and there's this unspoken, sometimes spoken, but mostly unspoken idea that, well, we don't have to worry about, heat is not a problem for them because it's hot in Mexico. They're used to it. It might be too hot for us, to work outside, but they're fine. And this is a idea that has deep roots in racial history. it was a big part of the sort of scientific racism that drove slavery in the 19th century. You know, there was a lot of, and I write about this in my book, there was a lot of back and forth with plantation owners, some of them with some, you know, minor twinges of conscience, worrying about their workers out in the cotton fields, you know, in the heat of the day. And there was this notion that was quite popular that, oh, they're from Africa, they're used to the heat, you know, they have thicker skulls or they have different sweat glands and they're fine, you know. And one of the, you know, important findings for me in my book is that all people are the same. There's no racial difference between how a Black person or a brown person or a white person experiences heat. There's no difference in the number of sweat glands. There's no difference in, you know, the circulatory system. There's no difference. There's obviously difference in skin color that has to do with, you know, sunlight and things like that, but it doesn't have anything to do with ability to endure heat. And you know, that's a really, I mean, there is differences with body size and health, but that's not racial, right? It's just, it depends on if you have a strong heart, a weak heart, a tall, slender body, a smaller, wider body, you know, those kinds of things can make a difference, but there's nothing racial about it. And I think that underlies a lot of the thinking about, certainly here in the United States. I mean, you know, we had this extreme heat dome here in Texas and in the Southwest just 2 weeks ago. And literally during that, in fact, literally, I think on the hottest day in Texas history, measured human history, and I may be wrong about it, whether it was exactly on the hottest day, but it was close to it. Our governor signed a legislation prohibiting any local ordinance, any city in Texas, from mandating water or shade breaks for workers, for outdoor workers. And, you know, this was just a deliberate, a clearly kind of barbaric, you know, legislation that, you know, he couched it all in economics, and, you know, we can't have workers sloughing off. And there's this whole Texas thing that I think there's also some in Australia too, of the, you know, we're tougher than heat, you know, we don't, you know, we're not wimps, you know, we can handle the heat. And you know, that kind of thing is just barbaric, and it's just tragic. And there's been, you know, a bunch of backlash against it here, but I think it's emblematic of the combination of sort of a kind of unspoken racism and a kind of macho ignorance about the real risks that we're facing.
Yes. And I think that like, you know, we can deal with heat thing came up in Australia in this really terrible way last year during the European heat wave, when there was Australians saying, oh, 40 degrees, that's nothing. You know, right. At the same time, now we know that like 60,000 people died, but there was this attitude of, oh, that's not that hard to handle. You must be weak. You must like not be able to handle it, you know. And like, I think part of that came from people's ignorance around, you know, who is dying in heat waves. Like, you know, it is like people who are in lower quality housing, it's poorer people, it's people with disabilities, it's migrants. And I don't think if they truly understood that, then they would have been making those jokes. But, you know, now we do know that 60, 70,000 people have died tragically last year, and that isn't going to be an exceptional number going forwards. We've got a question. I'm sort of trying to keep track of the questions in the chat as well. But there's one that's come up about, you know, is one of the situations in Europe quite different to the US, where people just don't have aircon? And that if we had aircon, then, you know, maybe people would be safer, and maybe that's a solution. But, you know, and that's a live discussion for us in Australia about, you know, should we, in our opinion, we should definitely be building houses a lot safer, regardless of whether they've got mechanical cooling or not. But there is an element of people who are just like, oh, we'll have the aircon. Like, is aircon the solution, or is it part of the problem? Like, we know that the IPCC, when they've talked about maladaptation, when we respond to the climate crisis in a way that makes the climate crisis worse by increasing carbon emissions, air conditioning is the number one example they use. So yeah, my question is is it the solution or the problem?
Well, I mean, I get that all the time too. And the answer is it's both, right? It's both a solution and a big part of the problem. And, but this notion that we don't have to worry about heat because we've got air conditioning and everything's going to be fine is like profoundly naive and profoundly dangerous in kind of thinking about the larger changes that are happening. So, I wrote this book, largely in an air-conditioned space in Texas. And I would go outside and try to write it and spend a day or so outside, and then it would get too hot and I would have to come back inside. I understand the virtue of air conditioning, and, it's something that we live with. But it's also true that, I'm an elite, and there are billions of people on this planet that who do not have air conditioning and are not going to get air conditioning. We do need to democratize access to cooling spaces more, for sure. That's really important. But this notion that everybody is just going to somehow get air conditioning and, that's going to solve the problem is just, profoundly naive. Secondly, we're not going to air condition the wheat fields, the cornfields, all of the, food production areas that are incredibly vulnerable to rising temperatures that have a big impact on our food supply. We're not going to air condition, the wildlife that is out there. Every living thing suffers from extreme heat in the same way humans do. And, we're just going to write them off and live in our air-conditioned bubble, and that's okay. And finally, the other problem with air conditioning is that it encourages a kind of architecture and building of these sort of sealed buildings and windows that don't open, and this kind of hermetically sealed off life that, can seem fine as long as everything's working. But, one of the infrastructure experts in my book that I spent a lot of time talking to talked about the inevitable, in his view, coming of what he called a heat Katrina, referring to Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans 10 years ago or so. And, that means that in a major city like Melbourne or in Sydney or in, Penrith or whatever place you want to name, and it's a 42-degree day and you have a power failure. And of course, the grid is most strained during these extreme heat waves. You have then a lot of people all of a sudden with no air conditioning, trapped in these unventilated buildings that become very, very dangerous. And in my book, I talk about air conditioning as this technology of forgetting also. I mean, because of air conditioning, generally people who are, the civilized world, but architects and home builders and people who buy homes have forgotten that we know how to build, other ways of cooling, the naturally cooling systems, moving air around over cool spaces. I mean, people lived in the Middle East in the 15th and 16th century and built amazing structures that were very cool. Here, even in Texas, it wasn't like nobody was living in Texas prior to air conditioning. Lots of people lived in Texas prior to air conditioning. And they built houses in different ways. They had, what's called dog trot houses, where the separation, big hallways in between, transoms that open up, letting the hot air move out. Just to wrap this up, I get a little worked up about air conditioning, as you can tell. But I had a conversation with a very famous architect whose name I won't reveal because we were kind of talking over drinks, and I wasn't on the record conversation. But he's built some very famous buildings that most of you would even know the names of if I told you about them. And I said, how do you think about air conditioning? And, how important is it to you in this office buildings and housing and stuff that you're building? And he said, we don't need it. I could design buildings that work without it, no problem. It's not necessary, even in the hottest climates. We know how to design to cool buildings off. But our clients insist on it. They want to be at 72 degrees or whatever the number is all the time. And so it's become this addiction to comfort more than anything else that is, very dangerous, because, we do know how to build in different ways, and we don't have to just build, glass boxes and steel boxes and then, bolt an air conditioner onto them.
Yeah, I think that resonates a lot in Australia. Like in our, it's not just apartments, but also in suburbs at the edges of our cities, you have a lot of very close together buildings with aircon. So there's no airflow. They're not being built to be naturally cooling. Sometimes they have no eaves or hardly any eaves. And if you think about, houses that were built in Australia in very hot areas, like after colonization to manage the heat, big verandas, like people could sleep outdoors, you could open the house, things like that. And it's actually, I think, quite a common sense thing that we talk to people about as like part of Sweltering Cities is saying, this isn't, it's not a design challenge in a way. Like, of course, it's amazing for us to continue to excel and create new materials and new houses, like new ways of building and things like that. But in terms of some low-hanging fruit, there's things like, in Western Sydney, you go into the outer suburbs, and you'll see a lot of black roofs, which we know heat, like not just our homes, but our suburbs. I think Matt Santamoris from UNSW has done studies to say if Sydney swapped over to lighter coloured roofs, it would cool the city 2.3 degrees, which, when you think about rising temperatures, like that could make a real difference. But
absolutely,
the problem is not that we know that cool roofs are a good idea. The problem is one of politics and one of companies saying, oh, we people want these. We could never ban black roofs because this is what people want. But this is low-hanging fruit that will save lives.
right?
So, just coming slightly on to the nature question, because something I really appreciated in the book was the stories about how nature is affected, because sometimes those stories help us understand the severity in a way that human stories, like, of course they do impact us, but for example, in parts of Australia, like flying foxes, they can't live above a certain temperature, so you'll see whole colonies die at once. So 500, 600, 700 flying foxes just dead on the ground during a heat wave, and that's become quite an evocative symbol for people. When you were learning about, when you're investigating the impact on nature, was there any particular story about an animal adapting or not adapting that really struck you, that you you found to be one of the more important ones? Or was it about diseases? Was it about mosquitoes? Like, what was something that struck you?
Well, as you know, if you've finished the book, the one that's very obvious is that I was on a cross-country ski trip on Baffin Island, going across basically the ice for 6 weeks, and was confronted and at very close distance by a very hungry polar bear with 2 cubs. And the reason that she was very hungry was because the ice that she needed to use as a hunting ground, as a perch for a hunting ground for seals, was gone. And so she was scavenging for food, and me and my friends looked like 2 big, very juicy hot dogs laying out on the ice. And so, why not go munch on them? So, that was an example of, polar bears are, often criticized as, overused icons of climate change and all that kind of thing. And they are in some ways, but it's also true that they're a great example of an animal that is perfectly adapted to the climate that they live in. And, one of the ways that all animals, including humans, deal with changes in heat is to move to cooler places. So frogs go up higher up the mountain where it's cooler. Mosquitoes fly to warmer places. They follow the heat essentially to stay in their sort of perfect, what I call in the book, the Goldilocks zone. But animals like polar bears have nowhere to go. There's no cooler place to go from the North Pole, right? And so those animals are in big trouble. Animals that can't migrate easily. I've written a lot and thought a lot about, I grew up in California, and there was big salmon runs there where the salmon They go out, they spawn in the freshwater rivers, and then they go out and spend their lives at sea, and then they come back 5 or 6 years later up the same rivers to spawn again in the exact same place where they were born. And as the heat rises and we have these extreme events, these streams that they go back up are too hot, and they basically suffocate, because when the water temperature rises really high, the oxygen level drops dramatically. And so you have these spawning salmon, which to me are iconic for all kinds of reasons of my own childhood and personal reasons and all that. But their entire life cycle is disrupted because of a change in the stream temperatures of a few degrees. And the ocean, I've been to the Great Barrier Reef, to Heron Island, a number of times, and that's one of the better preserved or better protected parts of the Barrier Reef. But even there, even in the times that I've been there, I've seen the changes. And we forget that when we're talking about extreme heat and things, we're not just talking about Penrith and Melbourne and Perth. We're talking about the vast ocean that surrounds us and all the life that's in that ocean, and these amazing, miraculous living structures like the barrier reefs that are just obviously incapable of moving at anything like the speed that they would need to move in order to deal with these extreme heats. And so they're goners, right? I mean, it's warming up too fast. And so the living things that are going to be sort of lost in this warming is, to me, one of the hardest to deal with, because this is dumb humans doing this, and all the rest of the sort of animal and plant kingdom are suffering for our greed and stupidity, basically.
Yeah, reading the book, it was maybe a surprise to me as someone who came to it with a certain point of view, that we did end up in the Antarctic and the Arctic in a book about heat. And what I enjoyed about it is, we're in these extremely hot places, and you go to somewhere very cold, and then we're back in hot places, and we go to somewhere very cold. And that contrast, isn't just, something you can almost feel in terms of the temperature, but also, you're going from the very local, someone dying, planting trees in the US, and their family story, to here is how the globe is being affected. Here is Antarctica, somewhere where so few people have ever been, where we can see the same the same phenomenon at a global scale. So that was really something that surprised me, but was very interesting to have included. I'm sure people appreciate it.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to write about Antarctica is because and I had an opportunity to go there on a research vessel, is to show, we are talking about extreme heat and high temperatures, and what happens when it's 42, 43, 44 C kind of thing. But I wanted to show that even small changes in temperature, like in the Southern Ocean, which is changed by only about 1 degree Fahrenheit, less than 1 C, has allowed the slightly warmer ocean water to get underneath these enormous ice sheets in West Antarctica, and destabilizing these enormous ice sheets and causing them to begin to kind of crack and fissure, which could lead to a large-scale collapse of these ice sheets and raise sea levels, a meter or two around the world. And so I really wanted to, it was the best place I knew to underscore this idea that, it's not just these big temperature jumps that are important. Even small temperature changes in certain environments like that have global consequences for millions of people and trillions of dollars of real estate and investment.
Yes, and it's a very, exciting part of the book, going to Antarctica as well. In the book, you also, at different points, reference social disruption and conflict caused by either heat waves or things like food insecurity related to rising temperatures. And I know there's some early studies coming out of the US saying that hate speech increases, with rising temperature, on hot days. And we know that assaults domestic violence, things like that, do also increase during heat waves. Did the process of writing this book change the way you think about the social impact of climate change? And I guess, where did you see the biggest warning signs when it comes to potential conflict related to rising temperatures? Also, this is a very serious question, but I also want to say that we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience in a sec. So if people want to get their questions in, please put them in the Q&A. But yeah, I guess, this question about social conflict leading from climate change.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it starts in a anecdotal way. I mean, all of us, anybody obviously on this call has experienced, extreme heat and been to or visited places where it's been very, very hot. And, you get cranky. It's hard. It changes your brain in a way, right? And there's not a lot of research about how that works. And, there's some stuff that I cite in the book, and there's beginning to be more and more of it. But how exactly heat changes our character is a really important and new area of research that's just kind of becoming, that is just unfolding, but it makes intuitive sense to anyone who has been in these kinds of situations. But the real, I think, engine of conflict driven by heat is migration and refugees and people moving, for example, Pakistan, where I set one chapter of the book, that the southern part of Pakistan is one of the hottest regions in the world, and there's millions of people who live there. It's a very politically unstable part of the world, and these people, like any living creature, will eventually need to move away from there because it's just too hot. And so where do they go, and what are the implications of that? And when you start thinking about vast swaths of the Middle East, for example, again, a very volatile part of the world, becoming too hot to live in for months at a time, what does that do to the political stability of that place, where you have tens of millions of people in a volatile part of the world seeking refuge and seeking cooler places? And then there's the one of the hardest things to grasp about climate crisis in general, I think, is this idea of these cascading consequences of one thing leading to another, leading to another, leading to another. And one example of this is related to heat and migration, and the things that we're talking about is, it's not just that it's too hot, so I'm going to try to move and go to a cooler place. It's that the crops are failing because it's hot, so there's no food. And so we have increased famine. Obviously, parts of our world, West Africa, other places, are already suffering from famine and food shortages. And as it gets hotter and hotter, that's just going to increase. And so it's too hot, there's no food, people are going to move. And that is an engine for conflict and chaos. And I live here in Texas. Migration, the border is the big issue. It drives everything in American politics right now. And in Australia also, obviously, you have similar kinds of issues with who can come, who can stay, who can go. And all of the politics of that is going to get much uglier as it gets hotter. And also things like sea level rise, especially for Australia, when you have these island nations that are looking for places to go. How is that going to be dealt with? It's a real, it's a hotter world is a more destabilized world.
Yeah, and I think thinking about the rights of climate refugees is such a important thing for us to do before we get to these crisis points. Like you mentioned, the sea level rise in the Pacific, and I know that people on the Pacific, it's a very fraught conversation in some ways around transitioning away from their countries and their communities, or staying and not doing that. So it's very fraught, and we need to obviously look to their leadership about what they want to happen. But it's definitely something that we can't wait until the disasters strike even more and more and more to tackle this political question. I'm glad to say that some of the questions in the chat have been a bit more optimistic about than mine, which is great to see from people. So I'm going to focus on a couple from John and Julie about solutions as well as the problem. So John talks a little bit about saying of, you know, some of the heat-related deaths in Phoenix last year, and I know this is also true of Los Angeles, that a huge number of the people who died were unhoused. And we know that poverty intersects very clearly with heat vulnerability. In terms of, you know, and it's like when I describe Sweltering Cities work, I talk about, you know, we're working at the intersection of climate change, health, and inequality. And that's not just a view of the problem. I think it also has to be a view of the solutions. That we are, you know, as you've been talking about with air conditioning, it's not, you know, if we've got an air-conditioned world and we've got people dying because their air conditioning breaks, like that's not an acceptable future that we should be going for. So are there any other things that, you know, like advocacy you've seen, solutions, government programs, things like that you've seen that are tackling like inequality and poverty as well as rising temperatures at the same time? Like who should we be looking to for good work on this that we can lift up and amplify?
Well, I mean, there's a wide variety of things going on around this. So, you know, one of the ones that you kind of hinted on there is, you know, we talked a lot about air conditioning, and one of the things that we didn't talk about and that I explored in my book a lot is that people who have air conditioning but can't afford to run it, right? Or are behind on their bills and have their electricity shut off and things like that. And in places like Phoenix, there's been a lot of progress on, you know, passing laws that, for example, forbid power companies from cutting off electricity, no matter where someone is on their bills, on days when the temperature is above a certain threshold. There's ways of subsidizing and making air conditioning cheaper for people who are marginal, who are having to make this decision between, do I turn my air conditioner on for an hour and a half, or do I save the money and buy dinner, you know, basically. And so there's been a lot of progress on trying to kind of democratize the penetration of air conditioning. That's been interesting on the policy level. You know, on the obviously urban trees, urban shade is a big issue. A big issue in Australia, a big issue in the United States. And trees are wonderful green spaces, public cooling that don't require you to have your own private, you know, air conditioned igloo, you know, and that places for people to go. Here in Texas, we see it in the public parks here on a hot day. People are they're just jammed, you know. So the virtues of shade as a commodity, you know, are really huge and as a public good. And you know, we're seeing opening of cooling centers that function not just for extreme heat, but for other kinds of disasters. These sort of, you know, public spaces that are designed with, you know, access to cooling, but also Wi-Fi and all kinds of things, places for people to go who don't have anywhere else to go when things get rough, whether it's from fires or whatever it is. I think creating these kind of public spaces. Other things that are really helping, I think there's a lot of innovation on messaging about climate change, I mean, about heat, you know, ranking heat waves, something I write about in my book. Naming heat waves, something I write about in my book. This, like, you name tropical storms or hurricanes, you know, communicating the risk to people, because, you know, some people say, I think this is a little facile, but it's true that nobody has to die in a heat wave, and it's sort of true, because if you have access to shade and cool and water, you don't have to die, right? And so it's very different than, you know, storms and drowning and things like that. So there's a lot of emphasis on that, on getting people to understand the risks better so they can take better actions themselves, looking in on people we know are vulnerable, you know, things like that. And then, you know, ultimately, this always comes back to the thing that can never be said enough, is that the reason that our temperatures are rising and it's getting hotter and hotter is because we continue to burn fossil fuels. And we have to reduce fossil fuel emissions much faster than we're doing. And Australia is, like Texas, where I live, one of the major culprits in all of this. And we need to look at that forthrightly and straightforwardly and understand that. And there's no longer any economic reason to be burning fossil fuels. Clean energy is much cheaper everywhere in the world than fossil fuel energy. Texas is booming with clean energy, solar power and wind power. So I think that we can't lose that in this sort of adaptation conversation. We have to remember that we have to keep pushing harder and harder and harder to eliminate fossil fuels from our cultures.
100%, Jeff. And I think that this is probably a good note for us to be wrapping up on. But it's definitely quite shocking from an Australian perspective to know and to speak to so many people about how severe the heat impacts are, whether that's doctors who tell stories of people dying in their homes, or people who tell us that they can't afford their air conditioning. And so when they feel sick with heat, they'll drive around or they'll go to the 24-hour Kmart, like Walmart equivalent. To know that and then see that Australia is still opening up coal mines is just totally unacceptable, I think, for anyone with a conscience and for anyone with any understanding of what the climate impacts we're already facing are and how severe they're going to be. So I know that that's our job in the Australian. I know people joining here are almost all from Australia, but definitely when we're telling these stories of heat, we have to continually make that demand that we need to turn off the oven, that there's
Absolutely.
We can plant trees, but we need to turn off the oven. And also, I can't believe we got to 50 minutes in before talking about trees, because normally it's one of the first things we talk about. But I think you also covered one of Julie's last questions. So where do you see signs of hope? But before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to let us know? I'll also then, make sure people are aware of the discount code, things like that. But is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we sign off?
Well, no, I would just like to underscore that, I do feel very hopeful about this moment in a bizarre way. The word hope is very complicated, but, I think that we're at this moment of transition in our world where we're going to figure out how to build a better world. We're going to be able to, we have this opportunity to redesign, to rethink how we generate energy, how we build homes, how we get around, kind of transportation we use. It's a revolution, and that's nothing new to say, but it's very exciting, and I'm very hopeful about it. And but I also think at the same time we really have to keep underscoring the risks and dangers, because I think if you don't grasp the scope and the scale and the speed of the changes that are happening, then the solutions that you suggest are band-aids, and they're not really looking deeply into the scale of what we face. And so I often push back on this. Virtually every conversation I have with a media person in this publication of this book so far ends with, okay, Jeff, are we doomed or not? Right? It's always that. And it's not a binary question. We have a lot of say in how this all plays out, and some will be better off than others. But we have to grasp, we can't shy away from talking about how much is going to be lost, how dangerous this is, what the risks really are, because only by facing that can we really come to grips with solutions and what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think exactly that about, when we understand the scale of the problem, we can stop thinking about heat as an individual issue that's about putting a coal towel on the back of your neck, or, whether you can afford air conditioning or not, and actually say millions of people are being affected at once. This is a huge problem, a severe problem, and therefore we need ambitious solutions. And we can be really positive about what those solutions are, and working with people to imagine a future where we have safe homes, where we have leafy streets, no matter how poor your neighborhood is, where we have great public transport and fruit and vegetables, not just for the rich, but for everyone, and clean air, clean water. And I think that future of talking about that with climate action is a really positive framing where we're acknowledging the problem, but we're also saying like the process of winning will improve all of our lives.
Right.
So that's, I think, yeah, I agree, an exciting point to get to. But thank you so much for taking the time today. I know you've been on lots of media, things like that, and I'm really glad you've been able to talk to us. We'll be sharing the video with people, but in case anyone wasn't aware, also Black Ink has given us a discount code for 25% off the registered retail price plus shipping for the book. I know we've had lots of questions about transport and agriculture and all sorts of different things, and I strongly encourage people to read the book. I do this work and I learned so much about, you know, heat impacts, and I really enjoyed it. So the code is HEAT 2023 at the checkout, and it's valid for the next week. And we'll also send that around with the video. But thank you so much, Jeff, for your time today. It's been, you know, a pleasure to have this discussion about very serious matters.
Thank you. It's been great. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope that we can do this again sometime.
Fantastic. Well, thanks to everyone who came along, and I'm sure we'll all talk soon. Thanks so much.
Yeah, bye.